Hi there, this is James Valvis coming at you with a new Poepinion. Poepinion is the only show on the internet in which Edgar Allan Poe takes over the body and mind of a semi-bright author in Issaquah, Washington. And some people have wondered how this goes on, what happens when this channeling happens. It seems that Mr. Poe has access to all of my thoughts, all of my memories, all of my information of modern times, and he uses that to go about to give his opinion about matters in the literary world. Now, when I'm just me, I don't have any of Poe's intellect or ability to discern literary matters as well as he does. So he basically jumps my IQ up a bunch so I can talk about these things without being a complete moron. So that's what's happening. And now, every now and then I get the urge. I feel Poe speaking to my mind, saying, "Please, please let me do a Poepinion." And so he has done that because he wants to talk to you about Sylvia Plath and suicides in literature. And so now I hand off things to Mr. Poe, and off we go. Now I was sitting around thinking about why so many artists kill themselves. Now there are many reasons for this. There's never any univariate reason for anything that happens. If someone walks across the street, it's partially because he wants to go get a Coke, and partially because that's the corner that's closest to his house, and partially because that's that's where the girl he likes will most likely see him walking past her house. There's all kinds of reasons why anything happens, especially something as complicated and as sad as a suicide. We've seen artists have a much greater propensity to kill themselves, either accidentally, in the case of, say, a Jimi Hendrix who drinks himself to death and chokes on his own vomit, or maybe that was Jim Morrison. I don't remember. But there's also those who just pull the trigger or suck the poison. And, when we think of these people, we think of Richard Brautigan, or Ernest Hemingway, or Sylvia Plath, or Anne Sexton. There's been, a few recent ones as well. Robin Williams was a very recent artist who took his own life. And so, none of these artists are a single case. So I don't want to give that impression right away. I don't want to. You can't narrow down all of the complexities of life into one small talk or one small theory. But I want to give something that's part of the reason why I think artists are particularly prone to killing themselves. One reason why that's the case. Not the only reason, but it's one reason. And it's simply this. I have been warning artists for some time now that as bad as insults are and as bad as criticism can feel, far, far more dangerous to them as artists and as people are compliments. I have said you should distrust every single compliment you get, and not only distrust it, you should dismiss it almost immediately, no matter how good it feels. And sometimes it feels really good. A writer or a artist in general is a generally ignored individual. There are exceptions to that, but even those exceptions usually crave approval. When you put out art that comes from the core of your person, and almost all art does this, when you're really one of those writers or artists in general my particular field is writing, and so therefore I say writers a lot. But it's universal. It's music. It's the visual arts. It's acting. It's anything that you do creatively. When you're putting your heart and soul into something like that emanates from you, uh, and people don't like it, that hurts. And when people do like it, that it can feel almost like they like you by liking the work. And so those two extremes are, it's not like say if you put together a widget at work and the boss likes your job but doesn't like your job. That widget is not you. All right. Nobody's going to say, oh well, Bobby's widget. It was a deep reflection of Bobby. It just doesn't happen. But a person's art really is a deep reflection of them, even if it's fiction, even if it's something that they made up, because it doesn't really even matter how much fiction is involved. Stephen King's books, as fanciful as they are, the premises are big reflections of who Stephen King is as a person. By the way, it's not a very good person, by the way. He's a very good writer, but he's not a very good person. Um, but the writing itself deeply reflects who you are. Take me, for instance, Edgar Allan Poe. Nobody was ever going to, come across the idea that Edgar Allan Poe, me, Mr. Poe, was a happy guy. It's just not going to happen. There's nothing in my writing that reflects that, and it doesn't mean I didn't have happy moments in my life, but it does mean that overall I was a rather morose and dark-minded individual. Now, the reason I say compliments are so disastrous is because this is what happens. Take someone like Sylvia Plath. Now, Sylvia Plath had mental issues. She was a person prone to depression, prone to suicidal thoughts. She was a person who was prone to grieve constantly over her life. Now, she had no real reason for this. This is to be understood. She had a very good life. Even though, she had trouble in her marriage, there was still, she was a successful writer. She was a person who was extremely intelligent. She had 2 children that I assume she loved and loved her. And, there was other people who cared about her and other ways that she had advantages in life. Look, if you're born in America or you're born in the West and you live in the West, I mean, she spent some time in England as well. You are greatly advantaged in life, just in general. The affluence of the West has been absurd, almost going back like 100 years now. I mean, World War II put a big dent in that, but otherwise, we've been extremely lucky people to live in the West. So if you're not feeling very well, then chances are that that's emanating from you rather than your conditions. There are exceptions. I mean, there are reasons why some people get depressed, and there are reasons why old people get depressed. But generally speaking, it's a matter of perspective. And so, doesn't mean there's not chemistry involved. A person who's prone to depression may be prone to depression because of chemicals in their brain or whatever else pushes them that way. None of this matters for what I'm going to say. There is a danger in compliments because they feel good. Anything that feels good makes you want to do it again. That's how we end up with drug problems, or we end up overeating. Believe me, the guy's body who I'm now possessing, big time problem with that. So you have all kinds of things that you can do that feel good that aren't healthy for you. Now, a lot of things you do that feel good can be healthy for you, but when it comes to writing, when it comes to the arts, and especially when it comes to poetry and that kind of thing, because listen, When people go into an art like poetry, it's usually not because they want to become successful or they want to become rich or famous. There's something about poetry that draws people into it, even while people know that it's not in and of itself a very um, terrific career path, to say the least. I mean, you can, if you are big enough or successful enough, do all right as a poet, but you're never going to do as all right as you would a novelist or as a screenwriter or as even a playwright or even a short story writer. It doesn't work that way, and it never will work that way. And so if you go into it emotionally, there's a reason for it. And so now here's what happens. Here's why I say compliments are so problematic. You're a kind of a depressed individual, like Sylvia Plath was a depressed individual. You write a poem about your depression, or you write a poem about some trauma that you endured. Think of her poem Daddy. Daddy, Daddy, I'm through. That poem. When she's, you know, lamenting her father's strict persona, comparing him to a Nazi, and comparing him to this authoritarian figure who's completely beaten her down, so that she feels like a Jew, but a Jew in the sense that she's a victim. Now, it is one thing to put that out in the world and to say and to write it, and that has a cathartic effect, and it's a possibility that you can overcome that. But here's what happens: you put it out there, and might have a cathartic effect while you're writing it, but then you put it out there and people love it. Then what happens? See, now the drug kicks in, right? People love you being sad. They love you being a victim. We're seeing this with the left. It's the whole mentality of the left. They love being a victim. They're bought into this idea that they get their pleasure from being a victim. And the more this happens, the more they want to be a victim. The more they write the poems of victimhood, the more they live in that victim mentality. It doesn't matter what the victimization is. It doesn't matter if it's rape or if it's, just some kind of other trauma. It doesn't matter what it is. They'll make up trauma just so they can get the drug of approval that comes with people saying, "Oh, you're so brave for giving us this trauma that you've been through." They'll do this over and over again. But what happens is, instead of getting happier, they get sadder. Because although they're getting approval from the masses, they're wallowing in their own sadness. They have to go deeper and deeper into the sadness to pull out more and more of it to feed the drug, and they keep this cycle happens. And then the next thing you know, they are so sad, they are so depressed, they're drugging themselves, or they're doing destructive things, or they're not writing anymore, and they've turned completely into zombies, or they've killed themselves. They've literally they've swallowed the bullet, or they've taken the pills, or they've put their head in the oven, in the case of Sylvia Plath, or whatever it is. In the case of Edgar Allan Poe, me, I drank myself to death, basically. And we've seen this over and over and over again with artists. And so the thing to do is to be if you're an artist, to be very, very leery of any kind of compliment and what they're complimenting. You see, you don't want to live, you don't want to feed the animal. There's the old story, like, you have two wolves fighting in the woods. Which one's going to live? Which one's going to win? And the answer is whichever one you feed, right? Whichever one you feed, that's the one that's going to win. The other one's going to starve to death and shrivel, and the other one's going to be strong and vibrant. And if you feed the one that is a killer, it's going to turn on you. They're going to come for you. And so you want to feed the happy wolf. You want to feed the one that, well, at least you don't want to feed them. You don't want to feed one to the exclusion of the other. You want to have some balance. You want to have some balance in the way you see the world. Black cat. Oh, the black cats. And so there are other examples of this. When you look at, Tony Robbins once used the analogy that if race drivers are taught to look at where they want to go rather than at the wall that they're heading towards. Like if they start to spin out, they have to look where they want to go, because then the brain will go toward that direction. But if they look at the wall, they're dead, because they'll go right into the wall. You will steer wherever you're looking. And so you see these writers like Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, and to a lesser extent, people like Brodigan and other people who write about their sorrows, and you think that they're so brave and they're so wonderful, and in some ways they are, but in other ways they're really heading toward a bad end. And the reason they're heading toward a bad end is because they're looking at the wall and they're feeding the bad wolf. And you can't do that too much. There's a danger to that. It doesn't matter what your trauma is, you can't live in it. Not as an artist, not as a person. And let me tell you something. This Jim Valvis guy, he's had a lot of trauma. A lot of trauma. We're talking about massive abuse as a child, sexual, physical, emotional, and we're talking about, inside the house, outside the house. You're talking about extreme poverty in which he was homeless many times. You're talking about a really horrible divorce. You're talking about betrayal from people he really thought he could trust, but couldn't, including many family members, as recently as just a couple months ago. And so when you look at this kind of stuff, how does a guy like that end up semi-sane, let alone thriving as an individual, and happy in his marriage, and happy in his home, and relatively happy in his life? Well, doesn't look at the wall all the time. He doesn't feed the bad wolf all the time. Sometimes the art is, about other things. When you look at Sylvia Plath's work, it's mostly about her own self-pity, about her own trauma. It's the same with Anne Sexton. And you can't go there, visit that world all the time without it crushing you. And so that would be my warning to all the artists out there. Anybody who's listening to this, any artist who comes into contact with my thoughts here, feed the wolf that you want to be fed. And it's hard, it's difficult, because if you say, I'm suffering and I feel a lot of pain and I'm depressed and sometimes I think about killing myself, you are going to get attention. You are going to get support. You are going to get people that pat you on the back. If you say I'm sad and I went through this trauma, people are going to say, oh, what you say is so powerful, what you say is so original, and what you say is so important. And you're going to like that. It's going to feel good. But I'm telling you, too much of it is poison. Too much of it will cripple you or even kill you. Don't go down that road. Fight it as much as possible. You can still do your work, but when those compliments come, have a step back. Put out the stop hand, and say, thank you, but this is no different than my other work. This is just that kind of poem that I'm writing for this time or it's that kind of story for now, but it's not every story. It's not any better than my other work. It's not any better than my other ideas. It's not any more important. You have to have a little bit of a shield there to say, I'm not going to feed that wolf all the time, because if I do, yeah, you're going to live in it. You're going to live in it, and at the very best you can hope for is that you're going to intentionally be sad all the time so that you can get the approval drug that you need. And that's not a good way to go. And I certainly don't want to see any more artists die, or any more young women, especially, who are prone to this kind of thing, who so desperately want approval and find it by being a victim. Our whole society is being overrun by this idea, this need for approval, the need to get the click, the like, the love from Facebook or social media. And it's hard to do something great and original and special. It's easy to be a victim. It's easy to get the drug that way. But that's a bad path. That's a bad wolf. And at the end of that road, there's always a wall, as Sylvia Plath found out. Okay. All right. Well, what do you know? Guess, let's see. Wow. Edgar Allan Poe talked for about 20 minutes there. I wonder what he said. Maybe I'll listen to it later. Anyway, this is James Valvis with his body back. I get to go do dumb things now. And as always, I appreciate you listening. And Mr. Poe appreciates it. And as always, thanks for listening. And God bless.